Soundstripe.
Welcome back to Heels in the Hierarchy, the space where we have honest conversations about the realities of working life, leadership, and everything in between. But before we start, don't forget to download, follow us on all our socials, and share to help with our reach. I'm SJ.
And I'm Pegsy.
And today's conversation is such an important one because we're talking about what it really feels like to start again, especially when you move into a completely different environment. We're joined by our guest today, Debbie, someone who began their career in a very people-focused beauty industry and then made the big shift into a much more commercial, male-dominated environment. It's not just about the job change. We talk about identity, confidence, and figuring out where you belong when actually something and everything feels so unfamiliar. We're so happy you're here today, Debbie. Can you share a little bit about the industry you are in now, your role and where you've come from?
Hello. So most of my experience is in sales, account management, customer service, business development type stuff. But my current role is as sales manager in the manufacturing industry. I work for a small business who is an agent that helps suppliers in continental Europe supply their materials into UK factories. So I spend most of my time driving up and down the M1 to see customers, make sure that they're covered for stocks, go over pricing forecasts. But also I take materials into the factories and run trials to give feedback to our suppliers. So it's much more technical role than previous roles I've had. Also a very male-dominated environment. My previous role, well, it was a few roles in one company over 10 years. And I was selling pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and cosmetic injections mainly. I started as a customer service rep, and then I joined the sales team. And that company ended up selling the sales department, which was all of the cosmetic injection side of things. So as a part of that deal, I moved over to the UK from North America to train and run the sales team in the UK, which was very exciting. And it was, I really enjoyed that role. It was a lot of exciting, a new experience, moving to a whole new country to do a new role.
And it sounds like there's some energy in behind that. So in terms of what you enjoyed about it, and there's quite a strong sense of who you were by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I did. I really enjoyed that role. I had a lot of confidence in that role because I worked with the company for 10 years. I'd started as a customer sales rep. So I went all the way from customer service onto the sales team, then leading a sales team in the UK up to business development. So I'd seen the whole scope of the business over 10 years. I knew what was going on. It was easy to have a lot of confidence in the role. I knew the products really well. It was also a really small amount of products. So it was easy to have confidence in that knowledge. But and I was interested in the products. It was a lot of skincare type stuff also, which made it easy to retain my product knowledge that way. So,
and it sounds like you had a quite strong sense of who you were in that role as a person. Where does that come from?
I think that comes from my upbringing as a whole. My parents raised me that way. I've got 4 sisters, and we were all raised being told constantly that you can do whatever you put your mind to. My mom was always a main breadwinner in the house. So I think that was a really good example to a bunch of girls also, to show that we could support ourselves, we could support a family, and that we could do whatever we wanted, whatever we put our minds to, really. That was instilled constantly.
So actually, it sounds like you had a really good, strong foundation. And I'm curious in terms of in your current role then, with that shift of changing, do you remember then your first real moment of thinking, oh, this is different? Even though you had the confidence, even though you kind of come fresh into a completely different area, was there a moment that you remember thinking, oh, yeah, this is not what I expected and this is different?
Like you'd said, yeah, I had a lot of confidence in the last role. And then when I moved into this new role in manufacturing, I was completely out of my depth. It was all new training, all new products, a lot more face-to-face interaction with customers. So there was a lot of just interpersonal learning and commercial side of things. It was on a different level than what I'd ever experienced. And I think if there was a moment that I'd noticed how different the industries were, it would have been when not long after I'd started in the role, we had a meeting with a supplier and we'd traveled over, and this was going to be a big commercial meeting as well as an introduction of me to the supplier. But the main focus really was to go over some accounts because there was an acquisition of a UK competitor to our company. We acted as an agent. There was a competitor that had been purchased by one of our suppliers. So it was figuring out how we navigated that. So we go to this meeting, and I should say actually that our company is owned and run by a married couple. And we arrived to the factory to have this meeting, and myself and the wife in the couple were moved into the customer service area of the business, while my other boss, the husband, went through to a different room. And we didn't really understand to start why we were in the customer service room. We thought that that was just a bit of say hello to everybody, because we were actually dealing with their team members pretty regularly. But we were sat there for quite a while and realized, oh, this meeting has started and we're not a part of the meeting. And for me, that wasn't necessarily significant, but my boss, who is 50% owner of the company, was not being included in a massive meeting deciding how the business was going to proceed with this new acquisition. So that was shocking, actually, and pretty eye-opening that there was such a clear difference in this instance anyways, in how...
Is that to do with the fact that you think it was to do with being female and being categorized?
In that scenario, yes. That was more of a culture difference, I think, with whether it was with that company or we were in a different country. But I had never experienced that before. So the previous role that I'd had, it was cosmetics. It was cosmetic injections. It was so heavily female dominated that I'd never come across a scenario like this where business owners wouldn't be involved in very serious decision making.
Yeah.
So that was a bit shocking. And then to realize that it was simply down to the fact that we were the women in the business. We were just automatically ushered into the customer service facing part and talk to you later.
And for me, that's quite shocking. And I suppose that transition seems quite like light and day from you didn't really notice anything before, and now suddenly you're thrust into a situation. But I'm wondering about how did that impact your transition then into that culture and that world when you first started? As that's your introduction into...
Yeah, I think it gave me a new insecurity, really, because again, in the previous role, although there were situations that I came up against that maybe it was because I was a woman that I was treated a bit differently or not received the way I should have been. However, I was so confident in that, and I knew what I was talking about. I knew what I was doing. It rolled off. It didn't bother me because I really had the confidence in my role. Whereas in this case, there was a huge learning curve. I didn't know everything yet. So it highlighted all of a sudden that I might be in situations here where even if I am fully capable and if I'm fully aware of what I'm doing, I still might not be received correctly or taken seriously. So what does that mean if I'm in a situation where I actually don't know everything that I'm talking about and still learning? It opened my eyes when I'd started out maybe being a bit naive to start.
Yeah, I suppose I think there's a lot going there, isn't it, around just your initial experience wasn't the best. It doesn't sound like in a transition, and that sounds like really impacted your confidence and the ability to even transition well when you're being received in that way. But looking back now, what do you think you actually underestimated then about that transition?
The main thing probably would be the time it took to feel comfortable in the role. I had a job previously where I knew everything that I was doing 3 months in and was pretty confident 3 months in. There wasn't such a range of things that I had to know. Again, it was a small product portfolio, where one product basically did the same thing as all the others. I was now moving into an environment where there was multiple products, multiple formulations, and COVID hit actually a couple of months after I'd started. So, in a job where you really needed to be in the factories, seeing materials running to get that knowledge and experience, I couldn't do that for almost 2 years. So,
Wow.
I think when I got to being in the role 2, 3 years, it felt a little bit like, "Oh, I should know what I'm doing by now, and I don't." So
Mm.
that was another on top of it.
I think that's quite significant. I
Yeah.
think it's hard to be in any kind of transition, let alone then having to go with a huge pandemic. And I suppose that makes me wonder whether there was an element that even made things worse around being imposter syndrome that we talk about quite a lot, Pegsy and I, around that element that we put on ourselves,
Mm,
expecting us to, and then we question ourselves. But when you've had an experience where that industry particularly sounds like you need to be face to face, you need to know the products, you need to be traveling, yet you're starting a new role
yeah.
in the middle of a pandemic where you couldn't do that. I'm curious about how did that impact you? And was there an element of imposter syndrome then?
Completely an element of imposter syndrome. And particularly once I'd gotten 2, 3 years in and still didn't fully feel like I knew what I was doing or talking about. So, yeah, it was tricky. But
It's interesting because when you were starting to talk about the differences, and obviously some people like change, some people don't like changes, but on the outside, it could be seen like, oh, actually, a change of complete role, seniority, taking on a challenge is really exciting. But actually, from the inside, what people don't see is what's happening in the inside, which is obviously a very different story. So, obviously, you're having to present a very confident and professional female in a male dominated industry whilst trying to learn a role that you hadn't had the right support in the initial way because of COVID, because obviously it was a huge transition for you. And so that's really difficult because sometimes that's the thing we don't really, I suppose, acknowledge that there is things that are it's happening internally all the time for us. I'm curious about what felt most different about the environment compared to where you'd come from, thinking about that element of imposter syndrome and what was happening for you at the time.
yeah, it
Like,
felt like I couldn't make mistakes. I was in a situation where it felt like I had to do everything perfectly because if I made any mistakes, it would just highlight that I didn't know what I was talking about. And that is not realistic. It's not realistic. Of course, you're going to make mistakes. And especially when you're learning and figuring it out, that is the best way to do it. And particularly in this environment, too, in manufacturing, when you're running trials and there's things going wrong on the lines and whatnot. It's that's when things go wrong, that's how you learn to
mm,
problem solve. But
yeah.
because I had this fear of doing everything wrong, I didn't actually allow myself to make those mistakes.
Yeah, and there is that sense, I think, as women, we have huge expectations of ourselves, so we don't really need other people's expectations because we already feel it
Mm.
all the time. And so, did you feel like you had to prove yourself in a different way because of the environment, because of the culture, and because of this transition?
Yeah, yeah, I did. I felt sort of the same thing that I couldn't make mistakes or I would be exposed for not knowing what I was talking about. I had to present everything perfectly or otherwise risk being considered incompetent.
That sounds quite a difficult pivot to try and be able to be open about being vulnerable, what you need, and then obviously having to be surrounding yourself about, oh, how do you adapt to that kind of culture? That must have been quite a shift from going feeling really, really secure in not only your role, but your environment. You worked in that company a long time, so you understood everybody and quite secure, to suddenly having to start questioning yourself, I suppose, again. However, I do wonder, did you ever feel like you had to adapt parts of yourself to then fit in?
Yeah, I did. I'm on the whole, I'm pretty introverted and shy naturally. And this environment now meant that I needed to put that aside and ask questions when I felt silly about it. Also, speak up when I knew what I was talking about and what we should do or shouldn't do, and with confidence when I wasn't necessarily feeling it. But on the whole, I'm grateful that I had to do that, because exercising that actually then just gave the confidence to continue doing it. So it felt like I needed to adapt, but actually I think that that was a positive adaptation overall.
I think generally women are very good at naturally adapting, but it sounds like you had an extremely difficult transition because of the COVID element as well, not being able to be exposed to that. And I'm kind of curious of all of that and the transition. What's actually made you stay? What was the difference for you?
I have a fantastic set of bosses that are very supportive, very understanding. And although I had this fear of making mistakes, I have to say that that was really self inflicted, because the support system that I had through my bosses and team members in being willing to help with the technical knowledge gap and whatnot, and even customers, even for the most part, were really, really happy to help and explain things in more detail if I asked. And it was, which was great. So I think the environment with the people around me, really, the team that I was working with, was the biggest reason for staying. It's
Well, it sounds like although you had that experience, that is the difference then, is who
yeah.
you're working for and whether you can go to them. And what have you discovered then about your skill set that you may have not known if you stayed where you were in that previous role where it was comfortable and you knew everything?
Yeah, probably my adaptability. I think that has been served really well in this role. And it wasn't really in the last one. I knew everything inside and out, and it was very same thing day in and day out. Whereas this role, you're interacting with so many different people, different factories, different procedures. You're constantly having to bridge the gap between your customers and suppliers in different countries who have different ways of doing things. And this has allowed me to exercise that adaptability in moving through those environments in a way that I wouldn't have in the last job. So that's been, yeah, really good.
And I'm curious about whether also the feedback element of utilizing that skill set has meant that you bring a richness to that industry that they may have not have had. I know that obviously you said about the couple being a married couple, but I think
Mhm.
that also brings a different dynamic, I'm sure. But also having the richness of a different perspective, being a woman owning that adaptability skill, being able to know and have that relational element must actually be such a strength that they probably didn't have before. So they wouldn't have hired you if you didn't have those skill sets. Everything else could be taught if it's a technical thing, but in terms of you as a person and the richness of who you are, that absolutely must make a difference into that industry that you're in.
Yeah, I think in some cases it definitely did. And whether it's the sort of feminine aspect or not, yeah, I guess I've definitely got a much more gentle and relaxed approach to sales than I think maybe is standard. And I think that that has allowed me in cases to get into customers and factories that I maybe, well, actually, it did allow me to get into factories that previously the company hadn't been able to get into. And I think that was just,
I don't think that's fluke. I think that
yeah,
sounds
leading
like
in
that.
gently and kindly and a lot softer than I've got this and you need it. More of a,
Oh. I think it's also about reading the room and building the
yeah,
relationship.
yeah,
It's adaptability, but I think
yeah,
there's that
yeah.
noticing and changing your approach
Hmm.
depending of who your client is and who your customer is. And it sounds like that's that's just been something that they've never had before, and bringing that. And I'm curious about whether you've noticed a shift at all in your experience over the years of being in that kind of male dominated industry at all.
Yeah, there has been a shift, but not because the industry itself has shifted.
Oh, interesting.
It's more how I move through it. Because really, the majority of the perceived problems I had being a woman in a male dominated industry, a lot of that I have found since has been my own perspective on it. And as I've gained my confidence and technical knowledge in the job, that has started to fall away. So,
That's a really healthy, I suppose, a healthy way to think about it. So instead of going, we need to shift the industry in the way that they're thinking and everything needs to change for us, what sounds like is that you acknowledged it and had an awareness, but actually it was your mindset that shifted
mhm,
and you started to work in a different way, but also utilizing who you were rather than trying to fit in and be somebody that you weren't. And
yeah,
that takes a long time. And I can understand why people would have probably moved on by now, but obviously you had such a good support network. You had
yeah.
that recognizing, and that sounds like a really healthy mindset.
Yeah, that's a key point for sure. I recognize that it was a lot easier for me to do that because I had the backing of my bosses and my team who had full confidence. So I wasn't, yeah, I had somewhere to land.
But also, it doesn't sound like you were sitting in a lonely place, that you had that. And I'm wondering for anyone who's listening and actually thinking or in that space around making a big career change, what is the one thing that you'd wish you'd known beforehand?
Well, I think I wish that I'd asked for more help and support and training earlier on. I absolutely had support and training, but I think out of fear of showing that I was incompetent, there were things that I didn't get as much support on that I should have earlier on. So if you know there's gaps, ask for help.
And I think that kind of is around learning from your experience about the mistakes you wish you hadn't done, is really about not being afraid of making mistakes. And what you said before, I've had conversations with Pegsy a few times around my motto is the fact that failure is not an option, it's essential or it's necessary. And you're absolutely right about you don't know what you don't know until you try something. And when you've had such a big career change in a different industry, that's already a lot to learn, let alone have these ridiculous expectations that as women we already put on ourselves. And that mindset shift of, I don't need to ask help because I don't know what my role is. I'm asking for support in order to shape me to
Mhm.
do my role and thrive in it, which is huge. And I think that element of helping people about stopping the silence of when we need support is not around vulnerability. It's about actually us wanting to thrive in the role and knowing the gaps of knowledge that we need in order to
Mhm.
thrive. So I think that's really important. And if there is someone feeling a little bit out of their depth in listening, and they're either in a new role or just about to start in a new role, what would what would you say to them, knowing what you do know and in terms of advice?
That's what we've already been saying. Don't be afraid of making mistakes because I think that I hindered my progress for sure, focusing way too much on small details and going over things with a fine tooth comb to make sure it was perfect. And that was at the expense of getting the job done because, again, I was too afraid of it not being right. But most of the time it was good enough. So, yeah.
And I'm curious about, in terms of workplaces, what do you wish workplaces actually understood better about people changing careers?
I think that even if the skill set is there for the role, if confidence is lacking, it can have a really big effect. So it is important to help build the confidence of the employee and whoever you've hired with good training and continued support so that they can feel they can still ask questions further down the line, not just at the beginning when things are new. Because I think sometimes you can get stuck in thinking, oh, it's been so long, I should know this, I should know that. When no, continued support and continued training as you progress.
So really less about the shaming, or it doesn't matter how long it takes somebody, but actually getting it right in order to thrive in the role. And it sounds also that element of companies being aware that actually transition looks different for everybody. And especially when you're making such a different career change in a different environment, it's like you say, it's not necessarily the skill set, but it's just giving time to adapt to a new culture, because culture has a huge part to play, not just the role, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. And having the culture that allows for that different learning depending on what works best for you. That's a really good point, because yes, for me, I needed to be hands-on doing things to learn. And that's, there's some people that might not have needed that, but I'm, again, lucky that my company and bosses recognize that and supported me in that.
I am curious though, what is the best piece of advice you've actually ever been given, and something that you can kind of share with other people?
And not necessarily just work related, but I think that people aren't thinking about you as much as you think they are. Everyone's too worried about how they're coming across, too worried about what they're doing, that if you do make a mistake or worried about how you've come across, don't have to worry about it. People care a lot less than you think. And I think that's, when I remember that, pretty freeing.
I think that's great advice. We are sometimes so aware what other people think, and that we get then stuck in ruminating about what's happened in the day or what people are thinking about us. And often that is absolutely not true, because we're self-absorbent and thinking about things. But
we're all too.
I think there's something really powerful about what you've shared today in terms of the transition, being real about what you need, and actually the idea that that confidence doesn't always transfer with you, but actually your capability absolutely does. That you don't have to become someone entirely new. You just have to learn how to bring your strengths into a different space and ask for support when you need it, but also having those honest conversations in the first instance. So thank you so much for being open with us. It's been a great conversation, and I'm sure our listeners would have taken a lot from that conversation. So yeah, been really great talking to you.
Thank you. And you. My pleasure.
So thanks for listening to Heels in the Hierarchy. And until next time,
keep your heels high
and your standards higher.